Hello. There we go. Nice. All right. Well, for those of y'all who were not here last week and you're wondering why I do not look like Pastor Rob, it's because I'm not Pastor Rob. Pastor Rob is currently on his sabbatical, and he will be gone for the next, 3 more weeks after this. And so y'all are stuck with me on Wednesday nights until he gets back. And that being said, because he's gone, I didn't want to continue on the John series, so we are hitting the pause button on the John series so that he can handle all that. But we are addressing a very similar topic, and we're really just focusing on the question of how to respond properly to God. Because that is really one of the chief questions that John is focused on in his gospel. And that's why we've seen so many different varied responses to John. And sometimes he even just leaves it hanging in the air when you have like Jesus talking with Nicodemus and you don't even know how that conversation ended, right? To where you're like, okay, because John's exploring different responses to Jesus and who he is. And so where we're at, we are going to be in Exodus 32 through 34 over the course of last week through the next 3 weeks after this. And today we're going to be picking up immediately where we left off last week. And then next week we're going to kind of skip a little bit and we're going to go to another segment there. But today we're going to be in Exodus 32 verses 7 through 14. And we are going to be picking up just right where we left off before. And so I probably need to give us some context. So if you weren't here last week, you know what was going on. Or if you're like me, you probably were here and still didn't remember what we talked about. And so Exodus 32 begins at this crucial place where the Israelites have been freed from bondage. They are at the foot of Mount Sinai. God's presence has come to dwell upon the mountain. God has spoken forth the initial words to his covenant to them. He has been like, hey, guys, y'all have seen what I can do for you. I have delivered you from bondage. And now I want to be your God. I want you to be my people. Let's make this covenant with one another. And he starts giving them this law. And then chapters pass and he starts giving them instructions on how to build a dwelling place for him called the tabernacle. And then before they actually build the tabernacle, we cut to this scene at the base of the mountain. Moses is up on top receiving all these instructions from God. And down at the bottom, the people have just totally abandoned God. But they don't believe they've abandoned God. Instead, they think that they've just given God a face. Right? Down at the bottom of the mountain, these people, they say, you know what? Moses has been gone for a while. We don't know what's up with him. We need a God who can lead us into the promised land. And so they talk to Moses' brother and they say, hey, will you make a statue for us? And he's like, absolutely. And so he makes them a golden calf made of all the jewelry that they got together. And they begin to worship this calf. And they even call the calf by the name of God. And they say that they are celebrating a feast to Yahweh as they're worshiping this thing, which so clearly violates what God has instructed them to do. And that's what we focused on last week. But now what we're going to do is, if this were a movie, I want you to imagine that the camera was focused on the base of the mountain. And then now it's panning upwards and it's zooming through the darkness of the clouds. And we are going to the top of the mountain where Moses is meeting with God. And today we're going to see how God responds and how Moses responds. And what we're going to see is that Moses has a really good grasp of the heart of God. And we can learn a lot about how to respond properly to God by what Moses does here. And so last week was a negative example. That's how you don't want to respond. Today, we get a super positive example through Moses. And so let's just start by reading the passage, and we're just going to take this in segments. We're going to talk with God's response, Moses' response, and then God's response to Moses' response. All right, Exodus 32, starting in verse 7. And the Lord said to Moses, go down, for your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation of you. So right off the bat, we see something that oftentimes we forget, and that is that God is always watching. So these people were down at the bottom and they didn't know what was up with Moses, and they decided they were going to make this statue that they called God. And you might have thought that God was distracted giving all these instructions to Moses, but no, he knew exactly what was going on down there. And so he tells Moses, hey, here's the deal. While I've been giving you these instructions, your people have turned away from me. We literally just made this covenant to one another a month and a half ago, and they've already turned from me. So God's always watching, which should put the fear of the Lord in us a little bit. Because last week, pretty much the entire lesson was that the Israelite story is our story, and that we do what they did all the time. And it's easy to look at them and be like, how can you be so dumb? But whenever we look at ourselves, we realize that we are so dumb very often. But God's always watching. And what I want to do is I want to just break down how God responds to this, because it's very telling. And one thing I want to clear up right off the bat, and I think I'll be able to demonstrate this to you over the course of this lesson, is that God's anger here is real. But ultimately, the things that he's saying here serve the greater purpose of testing Moses. And he's wanting to see if Moses understands his heart greater than the people of Israel. And I'm not saying that to act like to take away the weight of his words. His words carry a lot of weight. He is angry, and he has every right to be angry. But ultimately, he's seeking something greater. And he wants to test the heart of Moses and see if Moses has learned who he is. The first thing that I want you to notice here is the way that God speaks about these people. Go down, for your people, Moses, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. Well, that's kind of weird. I thought they were God's people. Well, God seems to beg to differ now. And there's two reasons why I think this could be the case. One, he is distancing himself from them. He says, yeah, we just made this covenant, and I said I wanted them to be my people, but apparently they had other plans. So Moses, you can have them. They're your people. But then there's also another thing I want to highlight. This is actually how they describe themselves. If you go back to the beginning of the chapter 32, verse 1, it says, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. So I think there's also the reality that God didn't just see their actions, he heard their words. And they gave the glory belonging to God to Moses, and God says, fine. Okay, Moses, you can have this one. They want to give you the credit? Take the credit. These are your people, so you can answer for them. But then I also want us to notice the things that God specifies that they did wrong. Because this is where we've seen what they've done wrong, and we talked about that last week, but now we get to see God's perspective on it. What is it that he particularly takes issue with that makes him so angry? The first thing is that they've corrupted themselves. Go down, for your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. This is one of those places I don't really like to go, like to push up my glasses and say, well, according to the Hebrew and Greek. But this is one of those places where the Hebrew is actually very helpful. Because in here, the Hebrew word for corrupted is the word shakat. And this word, if you did like a study of it to see where it shows up in the Bible, it shows up at two particular moments a lot in the book of Genesis. It's used 7 times to describe the corruption of the world shortly before the flood. Noah's flood at the beginning. The other time it shows up in Genesis, it shows up 3 times when God is describing the corruption in Sodom and Gomorrah. Safe to say, you don't want to be described as shakat. Because if you are God's holy people and you are being compared to the people before the flood and the people before Sodom and Gomorrah, not a good look, because what happened to the people before the flood? They got destroyed. What happened to the people before Sodom and Gomorrah? They got destroyed. What's God saying that he's wanting to do here? Destroy them, because they have corrupted themselves. And Sodom and Gomorrah, they had no Bible, right? The people at Noah's time, they had no Bible. These guys have already started receiving the law of God. They knew better, and therefore they are far more accountable for what they've done. And God says they have corrupted themselves. They said they wanted to be my people, and they're not acting like my people. And then notice what he goes on to say, verse 8. Not only have they corrupted themselves, but they have turned from the way. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.' If it wasn't a grievous enough evil for them to give credit to Moses for taking them out of Egypt, they also had the audacity to give the credit to a golden statue that they had made 5 minutes earlier." And God says, not only have they corrupted themselves and chosen the path of sin, they have literally just turned away from me. They thought that me, the God who is dwelling on a mountain who delivered you from the Red Sea, could be reduced to this tiny little golden image. This is significant just because it's wrong to do, but it's even more significant whenever you realize what the purpose of the people of Israel is. If you go way back to Genesis chapter 18, which once again is the story right before God destroys Sodom and Gomorrah, if you remember the story, Abraham has just been visited by 3 people, and one of them is God. And as they're walking and they're departing, they walk towards the area where they're overlooking Sodom, and God is preparing to destroy the place. But then God says, well, Abraham's here with me. And you realize he has a special relationship with Abraham. And this is what he says. Genesis chapter 18, verses 17 to 19. Yahweh said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? For I have chosen him, that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord," to keep the way of Yahweh, "by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised him." So in Genesis 18, you have God deciding, should I destroy Sodom? And he says, maybe what I should do, let me ask Abraham. It's a test. Because he says, I have specifically chosen Abraham for one job. He is the one appointed to keep the way of the Lord, to protect, to guard the way of God. That is his role for the whole world. Abraham has been specifically appointed to be the waykeeper. His descendants receive that same job. Isaac, Jacob, the 12 tribes, their job is to protect the way. They are supposed to be the ones through whom all the nations will be blessed. Everybody's supposed to look to them and say, that's how you serve God. The people of Israel have turned from the way. If they've turned from the way, then how are the rest of the nations going to learn how to serve the one true God? So what they've done is horrible. They've corrupted themselves and they've turned from the way. And not only have they done that, but they have also resisted God's guiding hand. Verse 9, "And the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people." This is the first time that they are described as stiff-necked in the Bible. It is not the last. They're actually going to be described as stiff-necked 4 times in these 3 chapters alone. Because God looks at them and he says, these are stubborn people. And even without knowing the historical context behind all of it, you can kind of get the idea that this means stubborn, right? It actually calls back to like guiding an ox, right? And you're trying to guide the ox, but he won't budge and he won't be guided. That's how God describes these people. He says, I have given them so much and I have taken care of them in so many ways, yet they won't be guided by me. Why are they so resistant? I have made them all these promises. I have told them that I am going to bless them and take care of them and make them a mighty nation. And I told them I'm going to give them this land and that if they obey me, things are just going to go great. Why would they choose to stray? The only answer is that they are stiff-necked. They're stubborn. They like the idea of worshiping God and serving God, but in reality, they love serving themselves more. And this is the part where it should hopefully get convicting for you like it is for me, because I have to once again remind you the same thing I said last week. This isn't just true about the people of Israel. This is our story as well. Every single day, we fall into situations where we corrupt ourselves, where we turn from the way, where we demonstrate that we likewise are stiff-necked people who just want to do our own thing. And so we can't just look at Israel and be like, yep, they're terrible. We should say, yeah, they are terrible, and I'm a lot like them. You should look at them, and it's almost like looking into a mirror. So those are the 3 things God's mad at them about, and now we need to see, what is God going to do as a result? The first thing he says he's going to do is he is going to consume them with his wrath. That's a scary thought. Now, therefore, let me alone that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them. Yikes. Things have escalated very, very quickly, but if you realize that this is a holy God who deserves all the glory and worship in the world, and that these people are not deserving of his covenant at all, you can see where his wrath is coming from. They understand more about his goodness and his grace than anybody else on the face of the planet. He literally just delivered them like 3 months earlier from captivity where they had been for 400 years. They know better. And he says, what else can I do? I destroyed the people during the flood for a lot less. I destroyed the people in Sodom and Gomorrah for a lot less. What choice do I have but to consume them? And then he's going to do a second thing. Not only is he going to consume them, he says he's going to make a great nation of Moses. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation of you. And now what I want us to do is I want us to consider this from Moses' perspective. Because this sounds like just an awesome opportunity. Basically, God's offering Moses the opportunity to be the new Abraham. Right? He says, hey, you know how everybody like has that song, Father Abraham and many sons of Father Abraham? He's like, that would be your song. Father Moses had many sons. You could be the one who has all the tribes. You could be the new Abraham. It could all be about you. You could be the one through whom the Messiah would come. Moses had settled into an easy life prior to being sent to the people. Just think about his story, right? He had been a prince in Egypt, but he'd escaped, and he spent 40 years out in the wilderness of Midian, and he had kind of gotten into just an easy life, and his life only got complicated again whenever these people came into the picture. And all of a sudden, things are getting harder. He'd already gotten a taste of how stiff-necked these people could be with their grumbling, because literally 3 days after they got through the Red Sea, they start complaining. And even before then, whenever he went there to deliver them, they were already complaining against him and turning against him whenever they weren't delivered immediately. So Moses' life was easy. These people made it hard. He's already seen how tiring ministering to them could be. If you go back to chapter 18 of Exodus, we literally see Moses sitting there, and there's a line of people coming up to him, one after another, asking him to take care of the problems, to where his father-in-law literally has to come up to him and says, Moses, you need to establish a system where other people can carry the load, because you're going to exhaust yourself doing this. So Moses knows how much baggage these people are. He's already tasted the difficulty of being mediator between God and man. Whenever God descended on the mountain, the people drew away. And they said, hey, Moses, how about this? God wants a relationship with us, but we would actually prefer it if he had a relationship with you, and you go up and down the mountain, despite the fact that you're like 80 years old. You just go up and down the mountain. We'll stay back here, and you just share God's words with us. And so they didn't want the baggage of having to maintain that relationship. So Moses understands how tiring these people can be. And from his perspective, it would be a lot easier to just take God up on his offer. I mean, this is awesome, right? He would be the new Abraham. In many ways, he'd be the new Noah, right? Starting anew. He's got to be the new Adam, right? The one who walks with God and talks with God, who knows God's voice. That's very enticing. He wouldn't have to deal with these grumbling people and their constant rebellion. Consider the fact that because he fixes this problem, he has to deal with them for 40 years and ultimately doesn't even end up getting to enter the promised land. All the blessings that God had promised would be a gift specially tailored towards him rather than a gift tailored towards all the descendants of Abraham. No, it would be specifically tailored towards Moses. He would be the chief heir of God's covenant, and ultimately, if all the other people are destroyed, God would have no choice but to deliver the Messiah through Moses. Right? So if Moses accepted this, he has everything to gain and nothing to lose. Like, this is a prime opportunity for him to just free himself from the burden of these people and all of his responsibilities, and he can just go live in luxury in the promised land, populate it with his own descendants. The Messiah could come through him. He could get all the credit for being the faithful one whenever everybody else was unfaithful. That was a very enticing thing. But let's see how Moses responds. Because this is where I'm going to argue that Moses understands God in a way that I hope we all learn to understand God. Picking up in verse 11. But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, "O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought up out of the land of Egypt, with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, with evil intent did he bring them out, to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self and said to them, I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and all this land that I have promised I will give to your offspring, and they shall inherit it forever. Moses rejects the offer. He had everything to gain and nothing to lose. But the reason he rejects it is because Moses understands the heart of God. And he sees this, and he hears what God is saying, but he knows that what God is suggesting doesn't line up with God's character. And he perceives that this is a test. And he says, okay, I know what's going on here. You want to see if I know you? I know you real well. And so he's going to respond, and he's going to do what the people asked. The people asked Moses to be a mediator between God and man. And so he's going to mediate. And he's going to appeal to God and ask him to spare the people. But before we talk about what Moses did, I want to highlight things that Moses didn't do. The first thing that he didn't do is that he didn't claim that the people deserve forgiveness. There is not a single point in here where Moses says, well, God, don't you think you're being a bit harsh? I mean, these people sinned, but it's just a statute. That's not that big of a deal. Moses never says that. There is never a moment where he tries to downplay the severity of what the people did. He's admitting, yeah, I admit this looks bad and they did something absolutely horrible. He just acknowledges that. Second thing he doesn't do, he doesn't claim that the people deserved God's gifts, right? There's not a place where he says, well, God, yeah, they did something bad, but don't you think that they still deserve the things you promised them? Come on. Yeah, you can punish them, but don't take it all away. They deserve it. He doesn't say that. There is no entitlement in the mind of Moses where he thinks that the people in any way are entitled to the covenant promises of God. He doesn't claim that. And then the third thing that he doesn't do is he doesn't ask for anything for himself. God offered him everything. And if I were Moses, I'd probably be like, God, let's see if we can, I like what you're saying, so maybe we can keep some of that. But maybe let's help out the people too. I would try to compromise, let's meet in the middle. Maybe I can receive some of it and they can receive some as well. He doesn't do that. Instead, he doesn't even acknowledge this offer. He's not like, oh yeah, that sounds great. No, he immediately says, God, that does not sound like you. Let's talk about the people. We need to talk about them. So he gets the attention off himself immediately, because what Moses is doing is that he values the glory of God over his personal gain in every way whatsoever. So let's look at what he actually did do. There's 3 things he did, and I have made them alliterate to make it easy on us to remember. He is going to remind God of his people, of his prestige, and of his promise. First off, he reminds God of his people. Verse 11. But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought up out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? If you ever played Uno, this is the equivalent of playing the Uno reverse card. Moses said, hey, these are your people whom you took out of the land. And Moses says, no, they're not. These are your people whom you took out of the land. Yes, they might not be giving you the credit you deserve, but I'm giving you that credit because you're the one who did it. I didn't do anything. I didn't take them out of the land. I didn't make this covenant. If anything, Moses resisted, right? God called him at the burning bush thing, and he was like, I don't want to go back. He says, these are your people. The only reason I'm here is because they're your people. The people may deserve destruction from God. Moses admits that, but they're God's people nonetheless. And so they have a special grace in his eyes. He says, God, I get it. These people are horrible. They're stiff-necked. I can admit that. But they're your people. Don't forget that. These are your people. And then the second thing he reminds God of, not that God needs these reminders, mind you. Once again, that's why I'm saying this is a test, ultimately. It's not like Moses is forcing the hand of God. We have evidence that God was hoping Moses would do this. And we'll see that in the third thing. But the second thing Moses does is he reminds God of his prestige. And the main reason I said prestige is because that's the closest synonym I could find for the word glory that started with a P. Because I wanted to make it alliterate. Verse 12. Why should the Egyptians say, with evil intent did he bring them out, to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn aside from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people. This is probably the place where I think Moses understands the heart of God the best. Because so often, if I was trying to sway the heart of God, I would think of so many different arguments that would sway the heart of man. And I would bring up all these different things. I would try to do the things that I said he didn't do. Or I'd be like, God, don't you think you're being a bit too harsh? Maybe we can be less severe. I would try stuff like that. But Moses gets it. And he says, God, consider your glory. Consider your reputation if you destroy these people. And that highlights what is motivating Moses. He's not motivated by his own personal gain. He is motivated by God's glory. He reminds God that this is not just about the people. Yes, they are God's people, but ultimately it's not just about them. It's about you, God, right? It's about your glory and how people look at you. A few months earlier, God revealed himself as the covenantal God who takes care of these people. And therefore, the entire world knows that Israel and Yahweh, package deal. And everybody knows that he really cares for them, right? Literally, there were some of those plagues in Egypt where the plague is falling on all of Egypt and the people of Israel are being spared. So everybody knows that Yahweh has identified himself with the people of Israel. And so Moses points out that, hey, God, all the eyes are on you right now. And in this way, he's actually doing exactly what Abraham did in that Sodom and Gomorrah incident. Do you remember that? Whenever God said, hey, Abraham is the protector of my way, let's see what he has to say. And Abraham says, far be it from you to punish the righteous with the wicked. And he begins to almost barter with God. And he says, what if there's 50 righteous? What if there's 45? What if there's 40? 35, 30? And it very quickly becomes evident that this is not a good bartering tactic because apparently there's not even 5 righteous people in Sodom. But Abraham understood the heart of God. And he said, consider your reputation. Moses is doing the exact same thing. He understands that when God called Abraham, he promised that in Abraham, all the families of the world would be blessed. And therefore he knew that the reason Yahweh had set Israel apart was that they would be like a light shining in the darkness, right? A lighthouse shining in the darkness, guiding ships safely to the shore. He says, these people have been specifically appointed for the purpose of guiding the nations to you. If you just destroy them, what are the nations going to think? The people may deserve destruction, but destroying them would actually work against Yahweh's ultimate purpose in appointing them to begin with. He says, God, the Egyptians are looking at you. They saw you deliver them through the Red Sea. Their armies suffered as a result and died. Think about how it's going to reflect on you if less than 3 months after that, all of them are destroyed. Would that make everybody want to follow you? It's a God who cares for them enough to deliver them from bondage, but immediately destroys them once they get into the wilderness. He says, God, your reputation's at stake here. He's not suggesting that the people deserve to be freed. He's just saying, God, you deserve to be worshiped. And I want you to do the thing that will inspire people to worship you the most. So show grace to them. The third thing he does is he reminds God of his promise. Verse 13. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self, and said to them, I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your offspring, and they will inherit it forever. So if the previous 2 points weren't enough, which honestly I think each of these points in isolation would have already swayed the heart of God, but if these previous 2 points weren't enough, Moses points out that technically God actually can't destroy the people because it would violate the promise he's made to them. And Moses knows that God is a God of truth. And this is where we get to see that Moses knows this is a test. Because he's like, God, I know you're saying you want to destroy them. And you might want to, but I know you can't. You made a promise to them, and that promise was not to Moses. The promise was to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Israel. Moses is but one man from the tribe of Levi. Abraham's seed is a lot bigger than that. And you promised Abraham's seed that they would receive the land. You promised the 12 tribes that they would receive things. It's already been prophesied that the Messiah is coming through the tribe of Judah, not Levi. You can't violate that. And so he says, remember your word. You can't do this to the people. And so right there, we see Moses really understands the heart of God. And then look at what God does. This is how God responds to Moses. Verse 14, and the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of bringing on his people. Well, that was easy. If you keep reading on, you'll see that all because Moses appealed on behalf of the people does not mean that he was happy with them. And if you keep going into the chapter, you'll see that Moses gets down from the mountain, and he's got the 2 tablets in his hand, and he sees these people, and now that he's actually seeing it with his eyes, he gets so mad, he grabs the tablets, throws them, and they break. And then he burns the golden calf down, mixes it with water, and makes the people drink it. And then some of the people do actually have to get killed. So I don't want you to take this as Moses going easy on the people. No. I mean, well, technically that is going easy on the people because they could have been destroyed. But I don't want you to take this as Moses taking it easy. This is Moses understanding the heart of God and passing the test. The people of Israel vastly misunderstood God, and that's why they thought they could reduce Yahweh to a golden calf, and that they could call their festival a feast to Yahweh, and that would suffice. Moses makes no mistakes there. He's like, no, that's ridiculous. Moses understands that God is a God of truth, and God is a God of love. And he is a God of grace, and he is a God deserving of glory. And therefore, because he's a God of love, he will take care of his people. And he won't immediately destroy them because they made a mistake. And because he is a God who deserves all glory, he's not going to do things that will stop people and encourage people to not give him that glory. And because he's a God of truth, he's not going to violate the promises that he made. And so Moses, he just gets it. He understands God in an intimate way that I wish all of us would, which leads us to the application of this whole thing. What do we do with information? Because I spent a lot of time talking about how we relate to the people of Israel, and I've talked a lot about the story itself, but what do we do with this information, and how do we respond to God in the same way that Moses responded to God? Because that's really the ultimate goal of this whole series that we're doing. It doesn't do any good to be like, wow, Moses really gets the heart of God. Anyways, let's move on. We want to learn to understand the heart of God in the same way that Moses understood it. And that's ultimately the whole goal of Scripture, right? All Scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, so that the servant of God may be thoroughly equipped to every good work. That's from 2 Timothy, right? God gave us Scripture to teach us, to rebuke us when we're wrong, to correct us and get us back on the right path, and to train us up so that we can model ourselves after the people in Scripture who did it well. And ultimately, we're to model ourselves after Christ. But right now, Christ hasn't arrived on the scene yet. So Moses is the best we've got so far. So what can we do? How do we take this and apply it in our own lives? I think what we do is we need to learn to value the same things that God values. Because that's what Moses is doing. He's not arguing for things based off of what man values. He's arguing for things based off what God values. And he knows that God values his people, his prestige, and his promise. So I'm going to argue that maybe we need to learn to value those same things. First off, we need to learn to value God's people. Moses appealed to God and said, these are your people, so treat them like your people. We need to recognize that we are God's people, and there are massive implications to that. In 1 Corinthians, Paul says, you are not your own, for you were bought with a price. If we are God's people, that means we are God's people. Right? We don't belong to ourselves. We belong to him, which means that there's 2 sides of this. On one side, like Moses is arguing for here, we can rest in God's grace towards us when we do sin, right? We're God's people, and so we can rest securely in knowing that he will be gracious towards us, and he won't immediately just consume us and destroy us when we turn to sin. At the same time, because we're God's people, we can't take that lightly, and we are called to protect the way, and we're called to guard the way, and we're to recognize we don't belong to ourselves. We're called to a higher standard, and we're called to live for him. And we have to recognize that the world will look to us as God's people. And therefore, the things that we do reflect on God. And the way that he treats us reflects on him. And so it goes both ways. We need to learn to value the fact that we are God's people, and so we rely on his grace, but also are called to live holy lives. Secondly, we need to learn to value God's prestige, value God's glory. And this is probably the main thing I want you to take away from here, because this is probably the most challenging thing that I see in my own life. And this is the thing that leaves me most impressed with Moses in this story. We must learn to value God's glory over anything that we have to gain. Just think about that for a moment. We must learn to value God's glory over anything that we have to gain from things. And if you're not realizing the implications of this, think about the sin that we commit in our lives. Isn't it our own desires and ambitions that usually lead us to sin? Usually the reason why we turn to sin in the first place is because we think that we have something to gain from it. Moses had everything to gain, yet he denied himself and metaphorically picked up his cross and followed God because he said, I value your glory more. He could have been the new Abraham. Instead, he ended up being the mediator between God and man for 40 years over a stiff-necked people who ultimately made him so mad one day that he yelled at them and then didn't get to go into the promised land. He could have been the one who inherited the whole promised land. But instead, he denied himself for the sake of God's glory. Usually the reason we turn to sin is because we're motivated by our own desires and our own ambitions. And usually it's because it's just the easier way to do things. And that's just how we conduct ourselves. But what if we weren't motivated by the decisions that make our life easy? What if instead we are motivated by the decisions that make our lives holy? What if we made it our goal not to simply have an easy life? We made it our goal to put God above everything and to follow in the footsteps of people like Moses or like David. You remember 2 Samuel chapter 6, whenever David is dancing before the Ark of the Covenant, taking it into Jerusalem, and he's like half naked, and his wife brings up the fact that that's kind of weird. You know what David says? I will become even more undignified than this, and I'll be humiliated in my own eyes. Because he says, I was dancing before the Lord. He says, yeah, I might be a king. People might be looking at me, but they know I was praising the Lord. I don't care how I look, as long as God gets the glory. Or what if we were like John the Baptist? We talked about this in John chapter 3. He must increase. I must decrease. Usually, we spend the majority of moments each given day finding ways to increase ourselves, right? Trying to gain something for ourselves. What if we did it for God instead? And to just give a personal example, this is very hard. We have to examine our own hearts. Like, I can apply this right now as I'm sitting right here. As I'm preaching this sermon, why am I doing it? Is it because I want to gain a bunch of compliments after I pray and dismiss y'all? Or is it because I ultimately want the Lord, who deserves all glory and honor and praise, to receive that glory and honor and praise? This is the decision that every pastor, preacher, teacher, worship leader faces every time they're up here. And this is the same decision y'all make every time you go to your jobs, right? Wherever you're at, you have to ask yourself, why am I here? Am I doing it because I want something? Or is it because I want to give God glory and I'll do that however I can? So that, like Paul said, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it for the glory of God. That's hard. And it takes a lot of heart searching. And you've got to look and be like, this isn't something that you can just look at actions and figure out if you're doing it. You literally have to look at the motivations of your heart and ask yourself, why am I doing this? Because Moses, he could have just accepted the offer and we'd be like, okay, cool. It was an offer that was given to him and we couldn't say he was wrong for taking it. But his heart wasn't chasing after his own glory or his own gain. Instead, he was chasing after God's glory. And so he denied himself. We need to learn to do the same thing. The third thing we need to do is we need to learn to value God's promise. We must place our hopes not in the things that we desire, but in the promises of God. Only he can fulfill us, and we must trust that he will be faithful to his promises. Moses turned to God and he said, remember your promise. Because that's what his hope was in. He wasn't placing his hope in being the heir of the promised land or having this amazing name. His hope was in the fact that God would fulfill the things that he said to Abraham. What if we lived our lives trusting in the promises of God? He has promised us that this world cannot satisfy us. He has promised us that he can. He has promised us that one day he's coming back and this world will pass away and there will be a new heaven and new earth where we will dwell with him forever. And there, all the things that we longed for in this world will be made a reality. What if, rather than placing our hope in this world, we placed our hope in his promises and what he said? That's how we replicate the heart of Moses here. And in replicating the heart of Moses, we're replicating the heart of God, because these are the things that God desires. And that's why I've been able to reference all these different things throughout Scripture, because this is not limited to just Moses. Moses is just one of the first people who truly gets it. And I pray he won't be the last. I pray that as we depart from here, each and every one of us will learn to value these same things, and we will learn to apply them in our own lives. And ultimately, that we will chase after God in the same way that Moses did. Dear Lord, thank you so much for your servant Moses and for the testimony that we get to receive from how he handled this situation, God. We don't deserve anything from you, and you deserve everything from us. And Moses got that. And I pray that for each person in this room, God, we will learn to value you as highly as Moses did, and that we won't pray for an easy life, but that we'll pray for a holy life, and that you will work on our hearts and help us learn to chase after you with all we've got. As we depart from here, I pray that you will keep everybody safe as they journey home, and I pray that you will bring us safely back here next week. We love you, God. We praise you. We thank you for everything that you are and everything that you have done, you are doing, and you will do. And it's in your holy and precious name we pray. Amen. All right, this is y'all's time of prayer. Y'all feel free to do that. And then when y'all are ready, y'all can get on out of here.